Welcome to the Regroup Hour, the podcast that's all about how we make and manage change by building a bedrock of self-care. Self-care that comes from self-awareness and self-compassion. This is a gentle hour-ish to take some time out for yourself, to simply be and see whatever this time brings. It truly is an opportunity to regroup. Hi, welcome back to the Regroup Hour. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm actually going to share the content from a mini retreat, a micro retreat, in fact, that I ran quite recently. And it's all about self-compassion. And I've been reminded again and again and again, like personally, through conversations with clients, through interactions that I've had with people on Instagram and Facebook, how important it is that we keep coming back to the feeling of self-compassion, that we keep checking in with ourselves about the degree of compassion with which we're holding ourselves. And so I just thought, let's have a whole session of the podcast, a whole episode dedicated to it, and actually just think a little bit more about what it is. And I'll also share a technique that you may find useful in helping to access self-compassion, because sometimes that can be part of the challenge. Actually, we're not trained or we're not accustomed to even sort of having a sense of what self-compassion feels like in our body. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. So I'm going to share a bit about the science of self-compassion and why it's important for our well-being. Also a little bit about why it can feel difficult at times, and then explore a practice that can help you cultivate it. And the other thing I'm going to do is share a reading as well from a book by Mark Nepo, who I think I've mentioned before on the podcast. And it just happened to be that day's reading. My husband reads to me every night before I go to sleep. I feel very honoured. It's something that we've been doing since lockdown, and it's definitely helped my sleep patterns. And the book that we read is this book by Mark Nepo, and it just so happened that the chapter or the entry that came up just before running this particular micro retreat was a piece all around compassion. So I'm going to read that to you as well. So we've got a few different things. And the other thing I'm going to include here is an invitation for a bit of a self-reflection exercise. So it may be something, depending upon where you are and where you're listening, it may be something that you just muse on in your head, or it may be something that you want to get a pen and a paper and jot down some thoughts. So obviously, as ever, entirely in your own hands. But why is it important to even think about this topic of self-compassion? For me, through my life experience, and also through the work that I do, and through so much of what I read and what I study, self-compassion is an absolutely intrinsic part of what builds that bedrock of self-care. And it's what helps us develop self-awareness. And those two things, so self-compassion and self-awareness, for me, they're the things that really drive our ability to make and manage change. And it doesn't matter what gender you are, it doesn't matter what life stage you're at. These two factors, when they align, and we are able to be self-aware with self-compassion, we are so much more able to be able to see the stuff that doesn't serve us and where the options are that we have to create change in order that we can put things in place that serve us better, all without judgment. So cultivating, developing, practicing self-compassion is a really powerful way to support ourselves, both in making and managing change, but also just in dealing with the general stresses that life can throw at us. And when we think about everything that people are dealing with right now, COVID, lockdown, homeschooling, these different ways of working, um, news being full of sort of sad stories, and distressing news all around us. These things, they layer up, and actually self-compassion is one of the core tools that we can use to help us really develop that self-resilience. So before I go any further, I just want to invite you to look around you and just look around wherever you are. If you're outside in nature, just take a moment to look up at the sky, look at the trees or the buildings that are near you, just see what greenery you can see. Um, Notice what the temperature is like against your skin. If you're inside, even if it's a room that you have spent every day in for the last year or the last however long, look around you and just see it, because so often we become really accustomed to where we are that we no longer see where we are. So just take a little moment, and just this simple practice can help ground us. And that can be an act of self compassion in itself. So, I want to share a little bit around the science of self compassion. It is, as I said before, it's a core part of how we calm ourselves when we're feeling anxious or stressed or overly critical or judgmental of ourselves. And and how it helps is that it induces changes in the part of the central nervous system known as the autonomic nervous system, specifically the parasympathetic division of the ANS, of the autonomic nervous system. So I've talked in previous episodes about the importance of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, and the different tasks that both sides are there to deliver. So the autonomic nervous system, it regulates many of our organs and muscles, and it affects functions like our heartbeat, our breathing, digestion, sweating, all things that are absolutely necessary for our ongoing physical well-being. And the parasympathetic division activates rest and repair, and the sympathetic activates our stress response, so flight, fight, or freeze. And the challenge is that if we end up in a prolonged state of stress where we're worrying about everybody and everything else, and we're not caring for ourselves, then our bodies and our minds simply don't function as well as they can. So, one of the things that can happen is we might gain weight. And this can be because of excess cortisol in our bodies. Now, cortisol is often sort of described as like a bad hormone. It's really not. There's nothing bad about our bodies at all. There's nothing bad about the job that cortisol does. But when there's excess cortisol, then our system can't process it, and we can end up gaining weight. And it's part of that self-preservation strategy, because if we're in a high state of stress, we can, our like ancient brain will then start to think, well, what if we don't get enough food? Because that's a core fundamental human need. So if we're not going to get enough food, I better lay down some fat in order to protect myself. Because we can't tell the difference between a real or a perceived threat. We can't tell the difference between an angry email and a saber-toothed tiger charging over the horizon at us. So our body, it kind of goes into this ancient solution for how to deal with the stress, and lays down fat because it wants to protect us. So we can end up gaining weight. The other really interesting thing here is that we also lose cognitive ability. So when our amygdala and our limbic system are really highly activated, so they're the ancient parts of our brain that put us into this fight, flight, freeze mode that protect us when we're under threat. When they're activated, the thinking, creative, empathic part of our brain in the prefrontal cortex gets switched off. So you can't have both functioning at the same time. They just, one switches off, one switches on, and that's it. Lights going on and off. And when we're highly stressed, we lose cognitive ability by up to 20%. So if you think about your IQ, so say your IQ is, I don't know, is 100. I'm choosing 100 because of maths. So say your IQ is 100. I'm sure it's over. Then, and you lose 20%, then you're down to an IQ of 80. And that's quite a significant drop in terms of your ability to problem solve. And we also lose empathy for others as well. So we lose our ability to connect with other people, and we lose our ability to be creative. And what happens when we engage the parasympathetic, when we come into a state of calm, and self-compassion is one of the tools that helps us achieve this. So when we engage the parasympathetic, we effectively reboot our neurological and our physiological systems. So everything starts coming back into optimum behavior. And this means that, so stress, for example, is one of the aging factors. If you spend your whole time really, really stressed, your skin will age because the parasympathetic, the part of us that's needed for rest and repair, doesn't have time to actually do cell regeneration. And that's why we end up looking older, perhaps, than we are. So the reason for sharing all of this is that practicing self-compassion helps us come into this place of calm. And it means that we look to do the kindest thing for ourselves. And that then helps restore homeostasis in our bodies, which means that we're calmer, we're clearer, we're more confident. And as a beautiful byproduct, we're also more present for others. And I'm going to share a bit of research that was done shortly. So if you're curious about some more of the science behind self-compassion and the reason why it is seen now to be absolutely fundamental to good mental well-being, then have an explore of Kristin Neff. That's Kristin Neff, Neff. And she is the queen of self-compassion. And how she describes it is, with self-compassion, we give ourselves the same kindness and care we give a good friend. And for so many of us, that concept feels really alien. We're really good at caring for everybody else. So I mentioned that there has been some studies around it, and Kristin Neff is a doctor of psychology. She's carried out a huge amount of research, and including looking at things like fMRI scans of people's heads. And there's one study which I think is really interesting, which is we can sometimes think that self-compassion is selfish, or that it's in some way self-indulgent. But actually, when we have learned how to practice self-compassion, we're actually much more empathic as well. We're much more able to connect with other people. And there have been some studies done looking at fMRI scans of People who have a self-compassion practice and people who don't. And the ones who do, when they observe someone in pain, the part of the brain that registers pain lights up in the people who have a self-compassion practice. So there is actually a much closer connection with other people. But equally, the people who've got the self-compassion practice are much more able to process the experience of what they're feeling. Whereas people who don't have the self-compassion practice, what their response to seeing somebody in pain can be actually much more emotional, but they don't necessarily feel the connection of what's going on. And often they can find it much harder to process what they're feeling. So there are some really powerful neuroscience reasons why self compassion is incredibly useful for us. And there was a study on nurses a few years ago where it was in Australia, where they'd noticed that nurses were really suffering from something that ended up being called empathic distress fatigue. And what had happened was that they were overwhelmed with the work they were doing. They were overwhelmed with the pain and the suffering that they were seeing all around them. And often, what happens when we're overwhelmed or we're exhausted is that we protect ourselves by building barriers around us. But what happens, and it's a self protection mechanism, so we switch off from feeling connected with other people. But actually, that then leads to feelings of isolation. And this is what they saw in the nurses, is that they were feeling so isolated because they'd had to build these strong barriers around themselves as a form of self-protection from the pain and the suffering that they were experiencing on a day-to-day level. And what they found, what these researchers found, is that by teaching compassion, by actually connecting the nurses with what they were feeling, it helped them process what they were experiencing much more successfully. And their energy and their overall mood improved dramatically. So, this practice of allowing ourselves to feel what we're feeling is a major part of self compassion, too. Rather than suppressing or ignoring things, we can actually learn to accept what we're feeling in a really compassionate way. But sometimes stuff obviously gets in the way. And one of the things that many people notice is that there's like this inner voice. We sometimes call it the inner critic or maybe the inner judge. And this inner voice or this inner judge is in charge of our self esteem. And it can often get in the way of us trying to care more compassionately for ourselves. So it might start using language around, well, that's selfish, and or you're just thinking about yourself there, and what about everybody else? So there may be some little voice that kicks in for you. Um, the source of our inner voice or our inner judge is often really easy to identify. So it's the voice of someone from our childhood, someone that we've assimilated into our consciousness. And we take these voices in because at key moments in the past, they sounded really compelling and irresistible. So possibly a voice of authority. And it can be a blend of voices, or it might just be one that for whatever reason stayed with us over the years. So for some of us, that inner voice, it could be the kind indulgence of a benevolent caregiver. You know, that might be the voice that we've assimilated, the primary inner voice that we hear. But for others, it may be the critical judgment of an irritated parent or a school bully or a teacher who seemed impossible to please. And And part of the challenge with this inner voice is that it can be really tempting to think that being hard on ourselves is a good thing. We can often have this sort of mentality of, the stiff upper lip, but that is part of our inner voice speaking. So self-flagellation, like beating ourselves up, it can sound like a really useful survival tactic to avoid the dangers of self-indulgence and complacency. But using a judgmental inner voice as our guide can also be really damaging. And it can lead to us being excessively harsh on ourselves. And actually, without compassion and only with that harsh inner voice, we can end up very, very low. We can end up in depression and we can even end up in suicide. So it really serves us to notice what's going on and then to explore different practices that can support us in bringing more compassion into our lives. And an important point here really is that we can't just switch off these voices because some of them have been there for a really long time, they might have been with us since childhood. They may have been with us since early adulthood. But what we can do is notice who's speaking. We can notice what they're saying, and we can take a little step back. We can take a breath, and we can shine a more compassionate light on the words that they're using. And I think another sort of key point here is, as well, is it's not about ignoring the inner voice, because the problem is that it's like, I've used this analogy before in the podcast. If there's a dog scratching at the door and you just ignore the dog, it's going to start barking, and eventually it'll break its way through. So suppressing it doesn't help. The important thing is to notice it and to listen to what it's saying, and then to see what the most compassionate next step is in order to move forward. So I'm going to share an exercise with you, which I've adapted from a really wonderful little book called Self-Knowledge by the School of Life, which is a kind of philosophy school that was created by Alain de Botton. It's a wonderful little book, very short, very pithy and concise, and full of great wisdom. I highly recommend it. And there's a little exercise in there that I'm going to share with you. So this is where, if you want a pen and paper, then grab one. And if you just want to do these in your head, then obviously just do that. So just take a little moment. I'm just having a little stretch. Oh, just a little settle. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to complete 5 statements. And all you need to do is note what comes to mind. So if you've got a pen and paper, write it down. And just listen to, who is it from your past or present that's dominating your inner voice. Remembering there might be more than one voice, or it might be an amalgamation of a few voices. So just note what you hear inside. So there are 5 questions. So number 1, when I do something foolish, I tell myself, just complete the sentence and note whose voice it is that's speaking. So I'll repeat that one. When I do something foolish, I tell myself. And the second one is, just complete the sentence. When I succeed at something, my inner voice says. I'll repeat that. When I succeed at something, my inner voice says. Remember, just notice whose voice is it that you're hearing, from your past or your present. Number 3, when I'm feeling lazy, I'll tell myself, I'll repeat that. When I'm feeling lazy, I'll tell myself. Number 4, when I get angry, my inner voice says, when I get angry, my inner voice says, and the last one, when I compare myself to others, I'll often hear myself say, when I compare myself to others, I'll often hear myself say, so I'm going to share these in the show notes as well. So if you didn't have a chance to complete them all, then you can do afterwards. So this may spark different or additional occasions when that inner voice appears. If that's true for you, then note those down and note down whose voice you hear. So sometimes it might be some kind of voice, other times it might be a different kind of voice. Just notice that. We're not trying to do anything with it, we're just noticing it at the moment. And against each one of those, just notice whether that voice was kind or was it punitive? Was it something that was judgmental? Just register your internal response. When you heard me saying those sentences, how did it feel? What words came up for you? So stay non-judgmental of your response and just notice what you're hearing and how it makes you feel. And as you reflect on these voices and who they belong to, it can be really helpful to remember that whosever voice it is, we have a choice about whether we choose to continue to listen. And just because the inner voice is saying something, it doesn't make it true. I'm just going to repeat those 2 points because I think they're really, really critical here. So we have a choice over whether we choose to continue to listen to what that inner voice is saying. And just because it's saying something doesn't make it true. So we've talked about how self-care is really core to this practice of self-compassion, and how self-compassion is really core to the practice of well-being. But sometimes it can be hard to work it out. And it's important as well to remember that being compassionate, it doesn't mean becoming a pushover or becoming unable to make difficult decisions. It actually makes us much more able to deal with the complexity of being with other people. It also enables us to speak much more clearly and honestly about what we're feeling. And that is beneficial to others as well. It helps other people do the same. And it helps us manage challenging circumstances because through this practice of self compassion, we see others as individuals who are deserving of our respect and compassion, just as we're deserving of theirs. So, the practice that I want to share before I finish with the reading from Mark Nepo is an invitation just to join me on a very little, very gentle bit of visualization. So it's a lovely practice to sit or to lie down, or again, if you're outside, just to sort of soften your eyes. Maybe you can lean against a tree. That's a lovely thing to do, or sit on a log somewhere, um, or look at the open sky. And we're going to take a moment to conjure a feeling of compassion by focusing on something outside of yourself, and then direct that feeling of compassion back to yourself. So The invitation is simply to bring to mind a small child or perhaps a young animal. So, whatever kind of comes to mind. So, as I speak, something will resonate with you. So, if you're thinking of a small child, maybe your own child, your nephew, niece, grandchild, child of a friend, whatever. Or if it feels more natural for you to bring to mind a young animal, then perhaps think of a puppy or a kitten or or maybe a baby bear, and just see how soft and sweet and playful they are. That delicious puppy smell, the insatiable curiosity of a kitten, the warmth and softness of a little creature's fur. Yeah, really bring them to mind in your life, and feel how it is to be with them. So just come in and focus on whatever has most resonated with you, and just really allow yourself to be with them, and focus on how it feels in your body as you think about them, as you feel about them. And perhaps just notice, where do you feel it in your body? And just allow that feeling to expand a little, to start to sort of fill your body. Think of them, picture them in your mind's eye. If you're a visual person, then really see them, and um, really explore like where they are, and how it is to be with them. Maybe they're playing, maybe they're sleeping. Allow a smile to come to your face as your body softens with the affection and the love you feel toward them. And as you do this, just continue to notice how your body feels. And imagine your tender compassion for them is a light that you're shining on them. And imagine that this light is the warmth of your affection. It's shining on this young creature that's come to your mind and come to your heart. And very gently, just turn that light toward yourself as well. So allow yourself to be bathed in the same light. Allow yourself to receive the warmth of that compassion that you're shining upon them. Give yourself a smile of recognition, and just notice how this feels. Maybe place a hand on your heart, or even give yourself a little hug. That can be a lovely gesture of self compassion. And remember that all things, including you, are worthy of your most compassionate attention. There is no hierarchy here. We are all equal. So, this approach, it can act as an anchor point when self compassion feels most challenging. But just notice how this feels, and you can always come back to this sensation. You can always come back to this little visualization, just to help yourself when you notice that self compassion perhaps feels more challenging. And remembering how it is to feel compassionate towards others, it grounds us, and it gives us a link into how we can remember it for ourselves. And of course, vice versa is true too. So you may want to keep your eyes closed here if you're somewhere that's safe to do so. And I'll just read to you from this lovely extract from Mark Nepo's book. And obviously, if it's safe to do so, then keep your eyes closed and perhaps just settle in and listen to this lovely extract from the Mark Nepo book. It's called The Book of Awakening. Having struggled for a lifetime with letting the needs of others define me, I've come to understand that without the healthiest form of self-love, without honouring the essence of life that this thing called self carries, the way a pod carries a seed, putting another before you can result in damaging self-sacrifice and endless codependence. I have, in many ways, over many years, suppressed my own needs and insights in an effort not to disappoint others, even when no one asked me to. This is not unique to me. Somehow, in the course of learning to be good, we have all been asked to wrestle with a false dilemma: being kind to ourselves or being kind to others. In truth, though, being kind to ourselves is a prerequisite to being kind to others. Honouring ourselves is, in fact, the only lasting way to release a truly selfless kindness to others. It is, I believe, as Mencius, the grandson of Confucius, says, that just as water unobstructed will flow downhill, we, given the chance to be what we are, will extend ourselves in kindness. So the real and lasting practice for each of us is to remove what obstructs us so that we can be who we are, holding nothing back. If we can work toward this kind of authenticity, then the living kindness, the water of compassion, will naturally flow. We do not need discipline to be kind, just an open heart. I think that's a really beautiful piece of writing. And this idea that we do not need discipline to be kind, just an open heart. I think it also speaks to the fact that we all have the capacity for self-compassion. So, as a final invitation, really, from this slightly different episode, the slightly different approach, is a journaling prompt. And the journaling prompt is, what would a true friend say? So, it's a powerful psychology when we change our thinking to that of a true friend. And the invitation is to think of a specific situation when the inner voice or that inner critic appeared, and to write down what a true friend would say about that situation. Remembering a true friend likes you exactly as you are. They're not trying to change you. They don't want you to become something other. They love you, they see you, they get you. So to think of a situation and then just write, what would a true friend say? And just see where your pen takes you. So I hope you've enjoyed this little exploration, and I'd love to know how it's resonated with you, and whether, having some of these self-reflection questions within the podcast is useful as well. Everything's an experiment, and that's what today was. So, and as ever, if there's anything that's come up for you that has prompted you to want to explore something more deeply, then you know where I am. You can always get in contact and either have a virtual coffee or come and do some work with me, because self-compassion, I believe, is one of our, it's one of the sort of fundamental muscles that really, when we nourish it, when we work it, when we, um, give it our most attentive energy, it can repay us in so many ways. And I would really, invite you to explore it. So as ever, thank you so much for listening, and thank you to the wonderful Angus MacLeod from Chango Music for his production and his beautiful music that he shares with us every week. And I send you a hug and a wave.